So we're in the second set of games now, and this is the first game in that set, Forklifter. I skipped the practice because it's pretty simple. They flick the food, you grab it with the fork. And there's a 2-beat gap between them flicking it and you grabbing it. That is, they flick on 1, you grab on 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So, some of them can be on the offbeat as well. That's important to know. I feel like this is an important game because it's the first game that you can't rely specifically on visual excuse me if I can speak, visual cues. You need the audio cues. And the food just comes too fast for you to work solely off of visual cues. This is a good first game to show someone. That said, there is something special coming up. Oh, hey, I paused it, and you might be like, whoa, no, get back to the game. No, listen, I have to explain something. What's coming up next is called a triplet. It's special, it looks like this. I won't explain too much about it right now. There's a whole game later in this game all about triplets. But just know, there's one in this song. I'll talk more about it later. Let's get back to it. I just wanted to let you know that what's coming up next is special and weird. That right there is a triplet, and if I remember correctly, I paused the video to talk about them, and if I forgot, I apologize, but I should have. Anyway, that's Forklifter. It's not too complicated. But hey, before we get into the next game, let's talk about some stuff, right? Now, I know last time I said I would talk about complex time signatures, but I figured I'd hold off on that until another time. I don't want to get ahead of myself, and we're still in the early going, you know? So I figured today I'd talk about more basic stuff, like note structure, talking about what types of notes there are and what they mean. And rests, for that matter. I'll talk about rests, too. So, let's start at the top. You've probably seen this before. It's a quarter note. It's probably what you think of when you think of a music note. And the actual official definition of a quarter note is a note with the duration of 1 beat. Now, I mentioned that, and I mentioned how specific that definition is, because the name quarter note is kind of a misnomer. It's kind of a weird name if you think about it. In 4/4 time, the most common time, it makes perfect sense. A quarter note is a fourth of the entire measure. A quarter, you need 4 of them to fill up the whole measure. Makes sense. But in most other time signatures, like 3/4 for instance, there's only 3 notes, or 3 beats I should say, in a measure. So you can't have a quarter note. You can't have a quarter of a measure. You can't divide 3 by 4. So, in that way, the name quarter note is a little weird, and there are other names for these notes, and I'll circle back around and talk about that later, but for now, let's call it a quarter note. So you know what that is. Let's look at notes above a quarter note. That is, notes with a higher duration, a longer duration. You got a half note, which you've probably seen before. Looks like a quarter note, but it's a little hollow, and its value is 2 beats. And then above that, you have the whole note, which is 4 beats. And that's a whole measure in 4/4 time. Makes sense. Now, you might be thinking, well, a whole note sure is a full measure in 4/4 time, but what happens if I drop a whole note in 3/4 time? What does that do? I want to have a single note that has the entire duration of a measure in 3/4 time. But a whole note is 4 beats. I can't do that. It won't fit. Well, they thought of that, and that's where this comes in. This is called a dot. And a dot can be placed on any note, and it will multiply the value by 1.5. So let's say you have a whole note. Put a dot on the whole note. Its value is multiplied by 1.5, so that's 4 times 1.5, 6 beats. Now, you won't see a dotted whole note too much. I suppose you could use it in... Oh, no. Actually, you can't use it in 6/8 time because an eighth note is a beat, not a quarter note. You won't see a dotted whole note too much, but you will see dotted half note. You might see where this is going. A half note is 2 beats. Put a dot on the end, multiply by 1.5, now it's 3 beats. And there you go. Now you have a dotted half note, which is one single note that has the duration of 3 beats, which can be used in 4/4 time too. Dotted half note is probably, I'd say, the most common dotted note there is. But it can also be used as a duration of a full measure in 3/4 time. So, pretty clever thing. You can also put a dot on a quarter note, and then its value is multiplied by 1.5, so now it's 1.5 beats. Now we should probably talk about notes below a quarter note. So below a quarter note you have an eighth note. You've probably seen this before. It looks like a quarter note with a little flag on the end. That is what it's officially called, is the flag, I'm pretty sure. And it has the value of half a beat. We've seen that before. You can put a dot on this too, by the way. You can put a dot on anything. See, below that you got a 16th note, which is still pretty common, but you can go lower. Okay? And this is where we get kind of funny. You know, you can totally have, you won't see it often, but you can totally have a 32nd note, a 64th note, a 128th note. You can have those. In fact, there are notes above a whole note as well. I forgot to talk about those. You have the double whole note, and there's one above that I forget the name of. But you won't see those too often, and you won't see notes below a 16th note that often either. I just want to mention them because I mentioned some notes have different names, and I think you'll mostly see these in Europe. I'm not actually sure, but a whole note can also be called a semi-breve. A note above the whole note, the double whole note, which is the duration of 2 measures, called a breve. So that's where that name comes from. Then you got the half note, which is, I think, pronounced a minim, or minim, maybe? It's not too important. Then we get to the fun ones. The quarter note is called a crochet. The 8th note is called a quaver. And now we get into the good stuff. A 16th note, semi-quaver. Makes sense, it's half of an 8th note, which is a quaver. Semi-quaver. What about a 32nd note? Demi-semi-quaver? And then a hemi-demi-semi-quaver? Then a semi-hemi-demi-semi-quaver? And then my favorite, 256, a demi-semi-hemi-demi-semi-quaver. These are real names. I pulled these from Wikipedia. I love them. So, that's all the notes. We got into kind of silly stuff with the, anything below a 16th note, but you should really keep everything above that in mind. So, whole note, half note, quarter note, 8th note, 16th note. Add a dot, multiplies the value by 1.5. That's what you want. You can also have double dots, but don't worry about those, okay? Now let's talk about rests. Rests are much the same way as notes. Notes have the duration which you should hold a music value. Rests is when you should not be playing. And they have similar values. You have this thing, which is a quarter rest, which you've seen before in these other videos, and you've probably seen before, in real life anyway. It has the value of, a full beat that you do not play. A fun thing to do is, if you meet a musician, ask them to draw a quarter rest, because I guarantee they will draw, they'll just draw a weird squiggle. That's all it is. Above that, we have a half rest. It looks like a little hat. That's how a lot of people remember. Half rest looks like a hat. And above that, you got a whole rest, which looks like a hole. That's how I remember it anyway. It looks like a hole. And these have the same value as their note counterparts. Half rest is 2 beats. A whole rest is 4 beats. You can also put dots on rests too. You can have a dotted half rest, which is 3 beats of rest. Important to know. And then we get down into the 8th rests, and it looks like a 7. And anything below that looks the same way as a 16th note does or a 32nd note does. We just add another little hook on the 7 like that. So that right there is a 16th rest, and then a 32nd rest, and you know, you can extrapolate from there. Again, you probably won't see anything below a 16th rest, so don't worry about it too much. I should mention, while we're on the subject, there are multi-measure rests, and those are kind of fun looking. You won't see them too much, but they do exist, and you definitely probably won't see them in any of the videos I make with Rhythm Heaven, but you should keep them in mind. And my favorite is, I believe it's called a coda, and it basically means stop playing. Stop playing until the conductor tells you to start playing again. It's just a funny symbol, and I'll talk about more musical symbols like this later. There are a lot of them. But yeah, that's pretty much the basics. Next time, maybe talk about time signatures again, because now we have a few more tools to talk about them more in depth. But until then, I'll see you later. So, Tambourine is the first game that I call Callin Response games. Now, Callin Response is a real thing in music, but what it means here is this monkey does something, and you need to repeat it exactly. There are 2 prompts in this game, one where you hit the tambourine normally, and one where you slam it by pressing A and B together. I'm showing every prompt up at the top. The notes that are solid, it means the regular tambourine beats, and the notes with the X's mean that's the hard ones with the A and B. I'm gonna sit back and let you watch though, it's pretty self-explanatory. It seems like a lot of people either find that game very easy or very difficult, and I feel like it's because of the dotted 8th notes in there. But yeah, that's the end of this one. Hope you learned some stuff. Next time we'll be finishing off set 2, and hopefully talking about the time signatures that I said.